There is much research that takes place in universities across Canada. The University of Lethbridge is no different. It recently earned national recognition for research on how gut inflammation drives changes in brain structure. Turns out there's a huge connection between our gut and the functioning of our other systems in the body. So today we are speaking with Dr. Chelsea Matisz, who did her postdoc research on the subject. She recently received a L'Oreal Canada for Women in Science Research Excellence Fellowship and one of 3 Royal Society of Canada Alice Wilson Awards. Dr. Matisz, she joins me now. Welcome to Bridge City News. And first of all, congratulations on your work being recognized.
Yes, thank you. Science is kind of a slow process. You plant seeds and it's years before you see results. So it's just one of those harvest seasons, it feels like.
How long have you been working on this?
So I've been working on this particular question since about 2017.
Okay.
So
it's been
yeah,
about 5 years.
4 or 5 years.
Okay, so this recognition obviously validates how important the research is and how widespread and debilitating gut inflammation can be for people. So some of us, may not always see that connection between the gut and the brain. So maybe tell us, how does chronic gut inflammation drive changes in brain structure? How does that all work?
Well, we are all familiar with what happens when you get sick. So imagine you have a bout of food poisoning or just some stomach upset, gastrointestinal bug of some kind. We all know what that feels like. You feel these classic sickness behaviors. You feel fatigue, lethargy. You don't enjoy your hobbies. You kind of just want to, recoil and go in a corner, and maybe you're a little bit more irritable to the people that you live with. But as the inflammation in your gut subsides, so do those sickness behaviors. But if you have chronic gut inflammation, that is a different situation because it becomes something that is your body needs to adapt to. You then still need to go out and get food and take care of your children. And so in some ways, the body is just adapting to this new normal, this chronic gut inflammation. And as a consequence, your brain has different changes to kind of accommodate for that. And this can be driven through immune mechanisms or neural mechanisms or hormonal mechanisms.
Okay, so what is it actually doing to the brain then?
So there's quite a number of things happening when you have chronic inflammation. One of the things that we see is it's highly comorbid with depression and anxiety. And so almost seems like sickness behaviors in the long term kind of morph into this depression, anxiety. And as a consequence, certain structures in your brain that are involved in assessing threats and how you cope with stress in your life, those parts of the brain become changed. And this is what we see, people that have chronic gut issues, or really any kind of chronic inflammation disease, what they will find is that, maybe they'll be in a period of remission where things seem to be okay, but then something will happen in their life, like a bad breakup, or perhaps, they lost their job, or a pet dies. Those stresses are enough to actually drive a flare, a remission, or a flare up of disease again. And so in this way, it changes the way your brain structure is, but also then how you perceive and respond to things in the environment. And that can also have then impacts on the disease itself.
Oh, that's fascinating. So can the condition of one's mind be based on how healthy their gut is? Is it kind of like symbiotic like that almost?
Absolutely. So that's a great question. People are always wondering, well, what can I do to kind of improve, the situation I have? So we have, there's medicines that people take that affect their gut inflammation, but also brain inflammation. And so those are often antidepressants or anti-anxiety medicines. But other things like cognitive behavioral therapy can be a way that people can sort of change the way that you perceive the environment to kind of help reduce amounts of stress. Other things like anything that can activate this beautiful nerve called the vagus nerve, can actually drive this anti-inflammatory pathway. And you can activate this through meditation, through deep breathing exercises, through yoga, singing. So there's lots of kind of different ways that you can sort of control from more of like a top-down way to kind of help manage
Wow. Yeah, that doesn't sound like modern medicine at all. It almost sounds like a jump in philosophy from Western medicine to Eastern medicine. Do you see it that way at all?
Certainly, there's a lot of value to the kinds of medicine that are practiced, not traditional medicine. Of course, I would always say that the most important thing is to see a professional doctor to manage the symptoms of disease, because that's really important. But I think increasingly people are recognizing that, the anxiety and the depression that is comorbid with lots of chronic diseases, it's not because you have the disease. You're not anxious and depressed because you have the disease. That's part of it, but it's also a very important component of the disease. The disease also involves these sort of behavioral changes to kind of adapt to this new normal. And in many ways, then treating the way that the anxiety and depression is an important component of treating the disease holistically. So certainly, like we all know, diet and exercise and good sleep, these are really important things to help um, with brain and body to help good function. But then there's these other little things that can be really helpful too, that maybe are more overlooked. But certainly, I wouldn't say that singing is a good thing to do instead of taking medicine.
Yeah, I can see how it would make you feel better though, especially if you're a good singer. Even if you're a bad singer, right? We all like to sing in the shower. So, does this also mean that maybe gut health could affect other brain functions like learning or memory or other things like that?
Yes, no,
Okay.
absolutely. People that have chronic gut inflammation will often experience not only anxiety and depression, but also cognitive dysfunction. So, this is kind of like working memory or focusing on certain things, attention. So, people that have chronic illnesses often will attend to the things that they experience. So, for example, they might attend more to um, things related to gut health, or things that remind them of pain or the anticipation of pain. So they might attend more to that, and so it does become kind of a bit of a reworking in that sense too. But certainly, cognitive dysfunction and this sort of brain fog that we hear about in terms of long COVID, it's a very real thing, and it's a part of the disease of the immune response.
It's so interesting. Could there also be a connection between gut health and, let's say, Alzheimer's disease, or is that completely different?
No, absolutely not. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that gut health impacts brain health in and mental health in many different kind of disease states. So, for example, people that have Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease or dementia, studies have looked at the communities of microbiota in their gut. So these are the bacteria, the fungi, the viruses that live in your gut all the time. But people that have chronic diseases, including Alzheimer's, they will notice the community of their gut will actually be shifted. It'll be less diverse. It might have certain sort of bugs in it that aren't really associated with healthy outcomes. And so we do see that it all is connected. The things that are in your gut, they can secrete things that directly act on neurons that go into the bloodstream and directly impact and are able to access the brain. And so we do know that, the microbiome is sort of like this living organ inside of us, producing things, responding to stress and diet and sleep. And so this also, is a huge part of sort of the holistic, uh, look at a particular disease.
It's interesting because that term gut health it's so thrown away. It's thrown around these days. It's kind of almost like a catchphrase. But when you get right down to the basics, what does it actually mean by having good gut health? Like we hear about the bad bacteria and whatnot. So, I mean, does it really just come down to a person's diet?
So this is a great question. And this is a question that researchers are asking, like, what is a healthy gut microbiome? And it's different for different people. A lot of it is genetic and sort of based on sort of what is around you. How was it a vaginal birth? Was it a cesarean section? What kind of foods were you exposed to as a child? Did you have a pet in the house? Are you an only child, or do you have a huge family? These things all make a difference. But of course, also the things that you eat and how you're exposed to things in your environment, that all makes a big difference as well. But what we do know is that there seems to be a core microbiome for people that once they sort of have reached a certain age, like maybe 3 or 4, it kind of stabilizes to some extent, but it does still shift. And we know that a healthy microbiome seems to be associated with increased diversity. So, people that have good health in older age will have a more diverse microbiome than people that may be suffering from different kinds of diseases, whether it's Alzheimer's or ulcerative colitis or diabetes. And so a diverse microbiome seems to be associated with health. And the best way to get a diverse microbiome is to eat a diverse diet, rich in different things. In particular, things that are like probiotics, like that have bacteria in them, like yogurts, things like that are fermented foods like kimchi or sauerkraut or kombucha, and then just lots and lots of fiber. Because plant fibers are very important because they don't get digested in your small intestine, so they go to your large intestine or your colon, and suddenly all those really important gut bacteria have food to eat. So if you're not eating a diet rich in fibers, then you're kind of starving out really important players in your gut microbiome that are important for your health.
Wow, that is fascinating. So, if somebody has chronic inflammation in the gut, what would you advise them to do? Is it mostly diet related, or could there be some other underlying problem there?
Well, I would always recommend, of course, people talk to their physicians and also get a referral to a specialist if you're dealing with gut specific problems. But I would also say it's important to, yes, start looking at the diet, starting a diet journal and getting a sense of, are there certain foods that might trigger discomfort? People frequently find that lactose or gluten, suddenly they have, sensitivities to that they weren't aware of before.
Mm.
But also, yes, I would say, a healthy diet is going to help anything. So, again, like a diet that's really rich in diversity. If you can try and incorporate it, fermented foods and lots of fibers and probiotics. So, I mean, it's an important component of health, but it's also important to start maybe paying a bit more attention to what's going in as well.
Hmm.
So, that food diary, I think, is something that most physicians would sort of recommend
Hmm.
people would
Okay, now,
struggle.
I understand that your work has therapeutic potential as well. So, what are you finding that may help remediate chronic inflammation induced changes in the brain?
So we're looking at a number of different things. My research program is kind of looking more from like top down. We're not looking at attenuating or suppressing gut inflammation, but rather we're looking at, okay, what's happening in the brain, and if we change things in the brain, might that change things in the gut too? And one of the things that we're looking at is psilocybin. And so this is a really exciting drug because it has been shown to have really, potential for people that have drug resistant depression. And so people that have, chronic gut illnesses and have this comorbid anxiety and depression, um, a different kind of drug might be really helpful for them. So we're looking at psilocybin, and I'm also looking at how certain cannabinoids might be helpful as well, like CBD. There's a whole bunch of other ones, CBG, CBDV. And so we're looking at sort of, non-traditional kinds of medicines to see how that might impact the brain.
So, it's still in the research phase now, or should people be running to the cannabis store to pick up these CBDs?
So I work with mice. I work with mouse models, and we're really good at curing diseases in mice. Of course, translating that to people is a little bit more difficult. But we're looking at the mechanisms to understand how these things might be helpful and how different groups of people that have diseases might be helped by certain things more than others. So there's a whole, subpopulations within a group of sick people that might find treatments that work for them that might not work for other people.
Hmm.
But I would say, people are finding success with certain kinds of cannabinoids in attenuating certain kinds of pain, or I'd say it's more related to pain than it is to inflammation. But that's it's a very case by case basis, and I would be hesitant to like recommend anyone do any without the advice of their doctor.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. Like, do you think that as a result of your research, that there could be other methods to treat mental health issues in the future? Like, where could this lead?
Absolutely. I think that by understanding how chronic inflammation changes the brain, I mean, because one of the problems is when you have chronic diseases and then you're in a period of remission and you're trying to stay in that remission, well, your brain structure has been changed fundamentally in certain ways. And then how can you kind of revert that back to, something that will improve your quality of life? Sure, it might be adaptive to have those changes in the brain, but evolution always doesn't really care about your quality of life. We want people to be happy and have healthy lives. And so some of these drugs that we're looking at are maybe more targeting sort of inflammation induced anxiety and depression, which is a different kind of depression than someone who maybe is a certain genetic predisposition to these sorts of things, or maybe experienced, trauma in early life that would lead to sort of depression and anxiety. So we're looking at a kind of a different perspective, like a different type of um, anxiety and depression in people. But I think that looking at the different kinds of drugs that might be available, and not necessarily the anti-inflammatory drugs that were traditionally looked at for, suppressing inflammation in the brain. I think by looking at some of these drugs that have been traditionally maligned and pushed aside as sort of psychedelics, and they're recreational and there's no value to them medicinally, I think increasingly researchers are understanding that's not the case. We really need access to these drugs so we can test them and try them and help people.
Yeah, it is absolutely fascinating stuff. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but Dr. Chelsea Matisz, thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate having you on. And once again, congratulations on being recognized nationally. That's a huge feat for you.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Chelsea Matisz is a researcher at the University of Lethbridge who was recently recognized nationally for her findings on the gut-brain health connection.